I shall never let go his hand. I shall never let go his hand. He has been so good to me. I shall never let go his hand. Jesus, I'll never forget what you've done for me. Jesus, I'll never forget how you set me free. Jesus, I'll never forget how you brought me out. Jesus, I'll never forget. No, never, never, never. How can I forget what you've done for me? How can I forget how you set me free? How can I forget how you brought me out? Jesus, I'll never forget. No, never. So often in life, we forget the bridge that brought us over. We forget the people who were there when we were barely making it. We forget the things that we learned that we didn't even know we needed to learn until after we had gone through those experiences. How we forget the mountains, the valleys, the curves, the detours, the U-turns, the things that simply turned our lives upside down. How can we forget the good times, the bad times, the times when we couldn't even tell time? So often we forget to think and to thank and to remember. We forget to think, to thank, and to remember. We forget to think, to thank, and to remember. And during these particular days, as we see so many different forms of news coverage, and as we see so many different people look at the same thing and yet come up with different conclusions, sometimes it's very hard to remember what we need to remember. One thing that I loved about North Carolina A&T State University, North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, is that one of the big mantras that we heard so many times was how they were nurturing and supportive, and how they were teaching us to think critically, teaching us not what to think, but teaching us how to think. And as you think and you thank God and you remember, and as you think and you thank God and you remember, we as African Americans must never forget our past. We must never forget our history. We must never forget our foundation. We must never forget how far we have come and what our forefathers have done for us. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we must remember how far God has brought us. And I look at Deuteronomy 5:15 to help substantiate what I'm sharing with you today. And in that particular book, I'm reading from Deuteronomy, that's in the Old Testament, 5:15 we find, and you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Now this is heavy. This is what I mean about we need to think and thank and remember. Deuteronomy 5:15, because this is us. This is us, brown people. This is us, people of color. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. And then further on in Deuteronomy, we find, you shall not be afraid of them. You shall well remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt. Deuteronomy 7:18, you shall not be afraid of them. You shall well remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt. And then Deuteronomy 8:2, and you shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. Folks, we must remember and never forget, so we can become humble, and so that we can go through testing, and so that we will know in our heart what the commandments are telling us to do. Over and over again in these verses from Deuteronomy, what we're finding, the key word, remember, 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 lest we forget. Lest we forget Gethsemane. Lest we forget Calvary. Lest we forget the stables. Lest we forget the angels. Lest we forget the baby Jesus. Lest we forget the cross. Lest we forget the crucifixion. Lest we forget Golgotha. Lest we forget the suffering. Lest we forget the pain. Lest we forget what Jesus went through to save you, and me. Lest we forget, because there are other things. You remember what you want to remember. Don't you remember your birthday? Don't you remember anniversaries? Don't you remember your class reunions? Don't you remember the day you get paid? Don't you remember special holidays? Don't you remember the 4th of July? How many of us are CME church goers? We go to church all the time on C, Christmas, M, Mother's Day, E, Easter. But I think God is looking for us on all of those Sabbath days where we can remember, lest we forget, what he and his son gave so that we might have eternal life. We must remember our African history. We must remember our African American history. We must remember the sacrifices that so many people gave so that we can be where we are today. I mean, it's a miracle for older people like me, AARP, chocolate people, senior citizens who are of the browner hue, permanent tans, when we can remember when there were segregated bathrooms, colored and white water fountains, when we could only go to the zoo and to the circus and to the museum and to art galleries and to the fair on Thursday, because that was the day in Memphis when colored people could go. Only on Thursdays. On Thursdays, you had to be chocolate to get into all of those venues. We cannot forget what we've been through and how far we have come, because now you can go where you want to go. If you have the money, you can do almost anything you want to do if you are able to qualify. And many times the qualifications start with, you got to have the money, you got to have the credentials, you have to have the qualifications. But the doors are open now. But what I'm talking about is the time when the doors were not open, and how we need to remember that so that we can celebrate and be thankful and say, God, we are just so glad that you brought us this far. This is why we must remember and never forget that NBC funded the Nat King Cole Show for 1 year back in 1956. But Nat King Cole's show, he canceled it in 1957 because Madison Avenue was afraid of the dark. This show was, it couldn't keep going because they did not have the advertisers. They did not have the commercials. They did not have the, what did I say earlier? The qualities to keep the show moving. And it all went back to green money. They didn't understand that chocolate people also had green money, and that we also contributed to the welfare of the building of the economy of the United States of America. But this is why the Nat King Cole Show in 1956 had to go off in the dark, because they didn't have the advertisers. The people on Madison Avenue would not support the show. We must remember 33-year-old Henry Box Brown, who shipped himself from Virginia to Philadelphia and went from slavery to freedom. Now that's what I call a real Underground Railroad. Shipped himself from Virginia to Philadelphia and went from slavery to freedom. We must remember that Black folks invented the 3-light traffic signal, refrigerated trucks, the automatic elevator doors, color monitors for desktop computers, the shape of the modern ironing board, the clothes wringer, the blood banks, the laser treatment for cataracts, home security systems, the Super Soaker children's toy, the clock, home security systems, potato chips. We must remember agricultural scientist George Washington Carver was responsible for creating over 500 new products made from peanuts, sweet potatoes, cooking oils, paint, soap. We must remember through African-American cowboys. Now, I didn't see many of those when I was a little girl, but African-American cowboys, they were the ones who played an important and integral part in popular narrative, so that historians could understand that this is what cowboys really did back in the Old West. African-American cowboys were riding those horses and riding those bulls and roping the cattle and taking care of the sheep and taking care of the goats. It was African American cowboys. They were out there. But how many of us who are probably senior citizens now, how many of us as little kids ever saw any chocolate African American cowboys? We must remember that Betty Boop was based on a black woman. We must remember that Jack Daniels, the world's most popular whiskey brand, until recently, a few people even knew that Jack Daniels liquor was created by Nathan Nearest Green, an enslaved black man who mentored a man named Jack Daniel, who got all the credit. Now remember what I just said. Nathan Nearest Green, an enslaved black man, he created the liquor, but it was named for the white man who was able to actually bottle it and market it and sell it, Jack Daniel. We must remember that Maya Angelou was the first black female cable car conductor in San Francisco, California. We must remember that slave owners often allowed slaves to play card games to help their counting skills. The card games evolved into games of bid whist, bridge, spades. All of that was born. We must remember that Madam C.J. Walker was the first self-made black female millionaire, and she came up with the Walker hair care system. Just think about that. The first black female millionaire in America. And what happened was she lost some of her hair, and she put together a recipe for a pomade that she had received from a dream from God. Did you hear what I said? Her hair started falling out. She was having some problems with her hair, like many of us sometimes do. And she had a dream, and God gave her the vision. Write the vision, make it plain. God gave her the vision to put together this pomade. It grew her hair back. She promoted it. She called it the Wonderful Hair Grower. She hired women to sell the product. And look what happened. And this lady had gone through so much. Madam C.J. Walker was born in 1867. She was an orphan when she was just 7 years old. She got married when she was 14. She became a mother when she was 17. Her husband died when she was 19, and she became a laundress when she was 18, and for 18 years to support her family. But look at the dream. Look at the dream from a laundress, from a washerwoman, to making that pomade that God put in her brain to help her hair grow. And it worked. And look at all that happened after then. The first self-made black female millionaire. We must remember that black slaves dreamed of freedom and sang in codes trying to leave southern states to get to northern states and to Canada and to get aboard the Underground Railroad and to make it over Deep River and to follow the North Star so they could get to the north and just go on through and make it. We must remember our forefathers and grandparents and mama them and daddy them who gave free labor. And they were tired and they were exhausted from working and slaving and just giving of everything they had for free, not being paid. We must remember as we sing those spirituals, oh, I couldn't hear nobody pray. Oh, I couldn't hear nobody pray. Way down yonder in my soul, I couldn't hear nobody pray. So pray for me. Pray for me. Pray for me. Negro spirituals that kept the slaves going. Steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. Don't you know what they were talking about? You know where they were going? They were getting ready to get on that Underground Railroad. They were getting ready to cross the deep river. They were getting ready to follow the great North Star. Steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. And then they'd be singing about Deep River, and they'd be singing tramping, trying to make heaven my home. Tramping, trying to make heaven my home. And they would go on as they were traveling and trying to get to the north, as they would cross water, wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. You see how creative those slaves were? You see how creative our forefathers were? Soon I will be done with the trouble of the world. With the trouble of the world. With the trouble of the world. Soon I will be done with the trouble of the world. I'm going home to live with God. 'Cause Jesus breaks every fetter. Jesus breaks every fetter. Jesus breaks every fetter. And he sets me free. You know what a fetter is? A chain. When you're in bondage, when you're in a straitjacket, when you can't get loose, when you're bound. Jesus breaks every fetter. Jesus breaks every fetter. Jesus breaks every fetter. And he sets me free. Don't stop praying. The Lord is nigh. Don't stop praying. He'll hear your cry. Oh, yes, because I'm bound for the promised land. I'm bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I'm bound for the promised land. And this is one I'll never forget. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. I'm a long, long way from home. Sometimes I feel like I ain't got a friend. Sometimes I feel like I ain't got a friend. Sometimes I feel like I ain't got a friend. I'm a long, long way from home. A long, long way from home. So we can all say, Father, I stretch my hand to thee. No other help I know. If thou wilt draw thyself from me, oh, whither shall I go? Remember the chains of the slaves, the chains of our forefathers, the chains. Remember the scriptures, how we must remember how we were slaves in a land of Egypt. Remember how God pulled us out and brought us out from bondage, from Pharaoh. We must remember how God has brought us such a mighty long way. Remember the next time when you're down in the dumps, when you're depressed, when you're suppressed, when you feel oppressed and you're holding your head down and you can't pull your head up and you're biting your fingernails and you crying big old crocodile tears and snot running all down your face. I dare you to remember what our folks went through, what our folks did, what our folks said. I see God working it out for me right now. I see God working it out for me. I see God working it out for me right now. I see God. He's working it out. He's working it out. And you know what? You can join me and sing that song too. I see God working it out for me right now. I see God working it out for me. I see God working it out for me right now. I see God working it out for me. He's working it out. He's working it out. Working it out for me right now. He's working it out. He's working it out. Working it out for me. This is why we must remember. This is why we can't forget. This is why we must think and thank and remember. I dare you, think and thank and remember. Think and thank and remember how far God has brought you, how far God has brought me, how far God has brought us, how far God has just pulled us through many dangers, toils, and snares. We have already come, but God, He brought us out. But God, He pulled us along the way. But God, He picked us up out of the miry clay. You better remember God. Lest you forget, you better remember God. Lest you forget, you better remember God. Think, thank, and remember. Think, thank, and remember. Think, thank, and remember how far God has brought you from. How far God has brought you from. How God has brought you from. You better think and thank. And as you think and thank, don't forget Amen Communications, where we give dollars to scholars to help students as we write books and as we remember faith over fear, faith over fear, faith over fear, as we think and thank and think and thank and think and thank and remember. Love you. God bless.